Terima kasih masih bergabung di Prime Words CNBC Indonesia dan kami masih berdiskusi bersama dengan Head of Representative from United Nations, Ms. Valerie Julliand. Ms. Valerie, moving on to the next questions. On the global economic projection for 2023, we see that the global condition next year can affect so many global economic growth, including Indonesia, starting from energy crisis, food prices, financial crisis, the high inflation, the upcoming recession. It will impact also the unfinished Russia and Ukraine war and so many geopolitical tensions as well. From the UN perspective, how deep is it the global economic clouds will be in 2023?
You know, I would say in general it's very difficult to give exact figures, mostly because we could have done a projection, let's say at the end of 2021, looking at how COVID was evolving and then the war in Ukraine started. Now we have the war in Ukraine, but we don't know what will happen in 2023. I really hope that there won't be a major disaster, but they can happen because, and when I mention disasters is for a reason, is that the climate crisis that we discussed earlier on also results in numerous disasters. And those disasters weigh enormously on the economy of countries. Every time you have a natural disaster, it represents a loss of GDP for the different nations. So we have to factor this in. But what is obvious is that with all the elements that you mentioned, the prices that are increasing, the inflation that is on average now about 5.5% in Indonesia, and in some countries it's 10, 12%. So it's enormous. With all this, it is anticipated that the overall global growth will be much slower next year than it has been in the past. Already, it was through a low during the years of COVID. Then 2021, some countries ended up having good recovery. Indonesia was one of them. You know that Indonesia already had a positive growth in 2021. But now with the war in Ukraine, it is estimated that the global growth will not be beyond 3%. It might be 2.7 or 3.1 as a maximum. So these are elements that are important because it means that everything will be slower and at all levels. But you were mentioning some difficulties and clouds. I don't remember exactly what you said, but it is, in fact, in those difficult times that nations need to really work together. You see, COVID tested not only the governance of countries, but it also tested the governance of the world that normally should be based on an issue of solidarity. If we want the world to function properly, we need to show solidarity between countries because not all countries have all what it takes to get out. And you cannot be a rich country sitting next to a poor country and not doing anything. This notion of global solidarity was exactly the topic that the Secretary General launched at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, saying it's a global crisis, we need to show, it's a shared responsibility, we need to show global solidarity. So yes, indeed, all the indicators point at the fact that next year it will be much less growth than anticipated. But also what we might see, it's a certain attitude that we have seen already appearing in some places of protectionism, where a country decide that because they do have something, then in order to protect themselves, they will close the market, they will stop to export or else. We are saying as UN that protectionism should not be applied because it goes against this very logic of solidarity. And I think that what those crises have demonstrated is that multilateralism, that is to say, let us work all together with a view of addressing together the problem, just as we do now with the crisis in Ukraine. It is a very essential way and the only possible way to respond to the crisis. And if I may, I would like to add that also I was saying, please, no protectionism, because protectionism is going to have, like, it will be salt on the wound, it will be oil on the fire. It will not solve the situation. But equally, in those times that are so difficult, this is when all the commitments, particularly vis-à-vis climate, have to be applied. So one would say, oh no, when it's complicated, maybe it's better that we continue to do as usual. Absolutely not. Renewable energy is an important agenda for the world. And even in those times, we need to focus on that. This being said, some countries, because of the inflation, because of the high cost of food, have already accumulated an enormous debt. So it is also very important to work with the international financial institution to make sure that all the mechanisms are in place so that there can be a level of debt support for those countries, because we still need to keep in each country enough fiscal space so that a country can continue to support its weakest and most vulnerable citizens. This is what Indonesia has been doing. From the beginning of the crisis, Indonesia has been supporting the most vulnerable with a subsidy. And it is important. This is the very concept of solidarity that I was referring to.
Right. Lastly, ma'am, what is the message from the United Nations so that Indonesia is able to maintain stability of national development amid so many threats of a dark cloud in the global economy next year?
I would say Indonesia is already party to numerous conventions and treaties in the United Nations. So Indonesia has already demonstrated its commitment to the global agenda, to the global ambition that the UN represents to a certain extent. So my message for Indonesia is to continue to be true to those commitments. And one of them is, of course, the SDGs. And Indonesia has been really a champion and working hard on the SDGs. But my message also to Indonesia is also to say, continue on the trend that has been the trend of the country so far in making sure that it really embraces all these commitments regarding the planet. As I was telling you earlier on, Indonesia is well positioned, has the capacity, the potential to really set an example and make sure that all the other, for instance, island nations, take an example on what Indonesia does as an archipelagic nation. And I would say to Indonesia, as I would say to any countries in the world, no matter the result of your GDP, if your people are suffering, your GDP, your global revenue can be very high. If your people are poor, you are not a rich country. So I would say, make sure that nobody is left behind. Because unfortunately, this is what is happening. The development that has taken place over the last century has actually benefited a lot to a smaller group of people. And then a large segment of the population was left behind. First of all, women. We haven't yet reached, we are not yet today in this world where there is a total equality of rights for women. And if there isn't a total equality of rights, there isn't as well an equality of opportunities. So women on so many aspects have been left behind. Then we have the issue of youth. Equally the youth. They represent the majority of the world population today, and yet they don't have access to the decision. They don't have access to the opportunities. Other people who are left behind are also the people with disability. Any nation in the world has on average about 15% of its population suffering from one disability or another. People who live in rural areas. In Indonesia, the people in the coastal areas also. In the east of the country do not have the same level of development as Java, for instance. So there are so many groups that are left behind. And my message to Indonesia, as it is for all the countries of the world, make sure to not leave anyone behind, because no country, in my view, can be considered rich if its people are poor.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us, Ms. Valerie Julliand. A pleasure to have you here with CNBC Indonesia. Thank you so much, ma'am. Demikianlah diskusi kami bersama dengan Valerie Julliand, United Nations Representative to Indonesia di Prime Words CNBC Indonesia.